So, Micah, I can't let it pass without asking you more about scripted journalism. What is it, and what are you thinking?
We've had our heads down in the news for as long as I've been there, and so we saw a lot of our peers having a little bit more fun, and I think we have that opportunity too. It'll be under the opinions umbrella, but I think that there's an opportunity for us to do short, satirical, topical storytelling.
Great. All of you, one common denominator was a lot of people doing a lot of things and experimenting, some working, some not. Let's talk about the implications for the journalists on your teams, because it kind of raises the issues of specialization, expertise, versus doing a lot of things, and versatility. I thought, why don't you start and talk about how you think about it, and then I'll just let others jump in.
Like cramming for an exam every day that you have nothing about, you've never had even opened a book about. It's hard. Having a lot of different, we're very, very diverse newsroom, and that's in terms of interest, gender, age, everything. And I think where we come from, the backgrounds, and that's really helped create a very niche kind of, in terms of the stories we cover. We don't really have beats, but there is definitely a distinction between people who do short form or do longer form, just because they're very different. Doing a 3-hour story is very different than doing a 3-week story. People rotate. They move from like teams to team if they want to. Some people don't want to. Being very fluid really helps according to people's passions, their interests, and also where they come from. If they come from the Guardian and 6-year background, it's very different than 23-year-old right out of college who just want to dive in and learn everything. So being flexible is really what helps us.
We've taken the video team and we've embedded them across the newsroom. So if you're a politics video editor or reporter, you're sitting with the politics team. If you're doing style, you're sitting with the style team. So we want them to be experts. We want them to build those relationships across the newsroom. It's really important to for the video folks to show that they're on equal footing as the rest of the journalists, and that's how good stories happen, and that's how we're ahead of them versus having a group of people who are sitting in a room just kind of taking the next thing off the assembly line.
Sanchez, you had at least 2, I believe, pretty powerful images of the use of drone video, but it made me wonder, in China, what's the restrictions? How is the government thinking about journalists and drone video? Because potentially it's giving you access to places you might not otherwise get.
Well, luckily, as of now, in terms of these emergency situations, especially the breaking news, they are not really aware of trying to block video shots from drones. And we own Shenzhen. In Shenzhen, they have the biggest commercial drone manufacturer in the world, DJI. So we got a lot of people who try to play around with this, not just video journalists, not just professionals, but a lot of amateurs. You was trying to fly things all over. And I would argue that in China, we have a very big traditional newsroom. So not everybody is well equipped with video journalist skills. We only have like less than 10 video journalists. But we're encouraging all the journalists or some of the correspondents that we have overseas to get a command with simple tools, just smartphones and those drones that are easy to command, to control, and try to create content out of their own chances whenever they have the chance to get a shoot. And in China, my observation is that people really don't care that much about the quality of video journalism, as long as they want to see the actual situation. And sometimes they just like these videos when people are running around and bumping, and they say they would consider that to be more real than all of the steady shots. So that's the take in China.
Mm-hmm. Robert, thinking about the Spider and just sort of built VR, whether it's built VR or VR that has sort of haptic or other kind of sensory things, take time. And I think one of the reasons we've seen more 360 video right now versus more built VR is just the speed. Yeah. talk about what's going to be the key for newsrooms or journalism schools saying it's worth it to focus more on the built-in 360 video.
That's actually why I mentioned the photogrammetry and the videogrammetry. If we wanted to do a CG, computer graphic 3D model-based experience, we'd have to hire a 3D artist, and most newsrooms don't have them to build and create those models. But with photogrammetry, I can take a series of photos of an object, run it through a program for free, and it spits out a model that potentially, if I'm telling the story of this room and I have these particular chairs, we're journalists. These are these particular chairs, not just a regular chair. So these are little details. What's that?
They're uncomfortable chairs.
They're awkward. I'm kind of leaning forward. That would be the awkward part of the story. But that's something that unlocks potentially with that. And we used that. We did a piece called Hell and High Water with ProPublica about the Houston Ship Channel, and one big moment there is about a storm surge that would generate a 30-foot wall of water. And as journalists, we try to show, don't tell kind of thing. We try to get you to think about, well, what's 30 feet feel like? It's like so-and-so, or as tall as a giraffe. Well, with CG graphics, I can use that to create that moment, to give you that sense of scale, the 30-foot wall of water about to hit a house. But to get to that, it took us some time. But it was the students, kind of like how you talked about your newsroom. The magic really in my class isn't the technology, but it's letting the students follow their passions and problem solve, and give them the freedom to experiment and to try this stuff. Hopefully there are more newsrooms that embrace that approach to give them that runway and that trust to do the journalism with those tools.
I would also add on to that part of the difficulty, which we didn't really touch upon, is actually convincing newsrooms that these are legitimate investments, especially if they're things that are very new or very complicated, or where the return on investment of them isn't, why do we need to do this? This is expensive, this is time consuming, when it was already such, especially for those of us who come from legacy organizations, to even make the move into digital, let alone be like, well, look at these really cool tools, and they're like, well, you have a video, that's enough. Just keep doing what you're doing.
By the way. Video
that's
is
enough, right?
Well, I was going to actually, if I ask a question, I was going to ask you both about that. Like, how do you guys decide, okay, Alexa is now worthwhile to build something in CG or VR or MR? Like, what's the threshold that you look for, and how long do you stay before you're like, it didn't work out, move on to the next thing?
Well, I think we jump quickly. We want to jump quickly on new technology to understand what the opportunity is, what the learning we would need to do. I think we're probably just as quick to decide whether something is not worth pursuing. All the things we've talked about today, Alexa, VR, AR, those are all things that we feel like have running room and we'll continue to experiment on. But our view is you'd much rather jump and figure it out, and we fortunately have the ability to do that, than to say, nah.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to a question here.
I'm Jonathan Groves from Drury University. Thanks for the inspirational stories and pushing us to experiment. That's definitely what we want to be doing in our classrooms. I was just curious, many of you mentioned Facebook, Facebook Live, Facebook Video, and I was just curious how deep the viewing experience you found from your audience in terms of what percentage are autoplay, what percentage are without sound, and what's the drop-off rate that you see from people?
You're the Facebook.
It really depends. Yeah, we are very much. It really depends on how long the video is. When you talk about retention rate, we typically, around 80% of our audience watch with sound off. When we experiment with things like vertical video, that changes a little bit because you need to kind of click in to watch it. Or when we place like the better with sound bug, all those kind of things. Or we do experiment with audio testimonies, like a couple of weeks ago with sarin attacks in Syria, we had just audio testimonies, so kind of experimenting with, well, how about we just animate text and use photos? So those will have different kind of rates. Retention on 1-minute videos is typically, if we have up to 30% of people watching at least 40% of the video, we consider that kind of a success. For longer videos, 2-minute videos, the drop-off rate is usually about 15% into the video. Autoplay, we do have a percentage of people who do turn off autoplay, but that's also because we have a lot of graphic stories. We are a newsroom and we've never shied away from that. We cover the world and the world is horrible. So regardless of how many warning graphics, so a lot of people do turn off autoplay. But yes, retention, we've never really taken views is very big because, as you've all seen, Facebook every couple of months they come out and they're like, oh, we're really sorry, the metrics are really screwed up. So we've never really taken views although they're great, be like, oh, well, our average video gets, we have a big sign in our office which says like 5 mil on a slow day. The average video gets around 500,000 views, if that's the kind of benchmark. But much better than that is if it gets over 10,000 shares, that's for us. And we've had up to 1 million shares.
So I'm going to start with Shaharya on this, but also ask all of you. And it's the question of, you talked about people being forgiving about quality if it's the right moment, the right thing. But I also think there's a flip side to that, which is particularly in the age of a lot of amateur video. One of the things that's going to distinguish professional journalism from that is quality. So can all of you talk about that balance between...
One of the reasons that's working out right now is because Facebook and YouTube both compress the video so much that it doesn't really matter if you're shooting in 4K. I mean, we never really bothered about investing in expensive equipment because, one, it's a waste of money. It's not, I mean, unless you're putting up an installation somewhere and giving someone a headset, that's different. And not many people own a cardboard or a headset, so it's kind of, again, a waste of money.
Right.
Two, smaller cameras work out because you're working in areas where you might need to run, or like, I mean, pretty much in the US as well, you might need to bounce immediately. So like running off with a big rig and a big battery is just not on. That's why the biggest thing pretty much is the Facebook and YouTube compression. You can shoot in 4K, it's not going to matter at the end of the day. So
I would add, though, that it really does make a difference. Like, it's just so pretty. We do a lot of, so our newsroom, for our normal news stories, when we use a lot of user-generated content, we use agencies such as Storyful and that kind of content. That's where, when the urgency of the news, that's where you don't really care about the visuals because you're watching graphics. But for another really successful part of AJ Plus, which is our VJ department, our video journalists, we work on commission, we use Story Hunter, and we have these beautiful stories that are shot from all over the world, and they're usually human stories, human solutions to human problems. They're much more feature stories, I guess would be the typical. And they're usually shot using traditional equipment. And they're just very, very visual. And that's one of the criteria to choose these stories. So it does make a difference.
definitely, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Definitely for feature and documentaries, you want...
and it depends on the platform. So Facebook, yes, much so. But also for YouTube, for our docs, we have docs, which are 8 minutes, which is crazy. And I think I used to watch like PBS or Frontline. It was like an hour. And now it's like 8 minutes. Oh, too much time. But those are also using equipment. So it depends also how much you've invested into it or what the tale of your story is. Do you want the story to be relevant a year from now, or is it just a story that's a news story for the day?
Yeah, and you talked about producing specifically for the platform. I mean, the experience you want or you're getting while you're standing in line for coffee in the morning on your phone is very different than the experience you want when you're sitting on your couch at night with a 50 or 65-inch television. So, we're very cognizant of making sure we're producing the right thing for the right platform at the right time. And we're not trying to force an 8 or 12-minute documentary into your morning, coffee routine. But we also know that 1 minute text on screen is not really the experience you want when you're sitting home, at night. So, it's the reason we're growing or we've had to grow is because, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. You can't publish once and expect it's going to work everywhere. Although I think at one point we were hopeful of that many years ago.
Well,
the Moscow protest video that was unable to play actually kind of illustrates my point that in terms of international reporting, especially in China's scene, for the average Chinese to understand international affairs through video, it's very important that you have professional explanation of the situation, and there are translation issues. So you can't simply have an amateur a tourist going to Paris and reporting on terrorist attack or any of the events that's happening over there. So here you need professional skills, at least language skills, that you need correspondents that may not be journalists, but people who understand how journalism works, how explanation works. So they are still shooting with phones and with bumping videos, but they have this illustration that the audio added into the video that is really the augmented value of the video that the amateur videos wouldn't be able to compete.
Right.
Yes, this question is for Sanchez. We hear a lot about the restrictions especially on media and online in China. We hear about Facebook being blocked. We hear about YouTube being blocked, which is why China has their own local versions of these websites. And my question for you is, in your experience, is the regulation by the government, is it affecting the speed at which these technologies are being embraced? And if not, is it affecting these technologies in any other way, the use of them within mainland China?
Well, actually, for this question, sadly not. Actually, because of the absence of all the international competitions, actually these companies, they have a larger domestic market share, and they are actually, getting more and more, VC money and all these kind of things, and they are not really out of touch with all the new technologies that's, happening in the U.S. or anywhere else. So they are bringing in the technologies, and they have somewhat protected, market competition position. So you can see if you are really living in China, in many of the ways that technology has been, in innovation and, all these kind of, daily life appliances, it's actually growing very fast. I would argue maybe not as, maybe as fast as the U.S., if not faster. That's my argument. If you look at one example that some of the U.S. media has been reporting that the Chinese version of Facebook Messenger, that's WeChat, actually is having a lot of very good features and is very good to use even for the many of the foreigners living in China. They would consider that WeChat is much more functional and better app than many of its competitors in the West.
So it has not affected the embrace of the technologies by the public?
Not at all. Sadly.
Great. We are at time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.